Good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Dalibor Rohac, or Rohac, if you will, and I'm a research fellow here at AI. My work focuses on Europe's political economy and also on explaining to my friends on the conservative and free market right here in the United States the importance of the European project and why the continual existence of the European project is very much in the US interest. And considering the positions taken by this administration, you can see that my work here has been a resounding success. But on a more serious note, like in that famous Chinese curse, Europe right now is living through interesting times. At the same time, I would add that the many predictions made of the EU's imminent collapse have proven so far to be more than a little premature. This weekend, Europeans will vote in the European election in the 28 member states. In the past, this was mostly not a terribly exciting affair, resulting usually in the European Parliament dominated by the two large political families, the European People's Party and Socialists and Democrats. As you might realize, it is much more exciting and less boring this year. The outcome is rather uncertain, and that's why we decided to dedicate a whole public event to a conversation about what this election means for Europe, for the transatlantic relations, and the future of Western alliances. We have four speakers, myself included, to walk you through the upcoming election, including Ambassador Santiago Cabanas of Spain, who is one of the most senior diplomats in Spanish Foreign Service, which he joined in 1981, which I'm not saying to remind him of his age, obviously, but he served as the director of the Foreign Minister's Cabinet, Director General for Foreign Policy. He held ambassadorships in Jordan, Algeria, and also in the Czech Republic before coming to the United States. And in the US, in the past, he held several diplomatic posts earlier in his career. Also delighted to welcome Ben Judah to AI. He is, like myself, a columnist with the American Interest magazine, among many other publications to which he contributed, and he's really one of the sharpest, most penetrating writers in English language of his generation. So if you haven't read This is London, you should do yourself a favor and get a copy. We also have Yascha Mounk on the panel, or Manel, I'm sorry to say, who is an associate professor of practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University and one of the world's leading experts on populism, democratic decline, and authoritarianism. His latest book is The Age of Responsibility, Luck, Choice, and the Welfare State, which is being published by Harvard University Press next month. Without any further ado, I'll leave you in the capable hands of Stan Veuger, my colleague here at AI, brilliant economist of Dutch extraction and a fellow Europe explainer. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Dalibor. What I'm going to try and do is we're going to organize this conversation around sort of four themes. First, we'll talk about where is the European project going. What member states will be part of the European Union a year from now. After that, we'll talk more about sort of the broader political trends. We'll talk about populism, about the fragmentation of the political spectrum. Third block, we'd like to dedicate to where is the European People's Party going. Obviously, recent developments in Austria show us one potential outcome of going toward an alliance with parties of a more popular far-right variety. We'll dedicate a little bit of time to the future of the left as well, but I think the EPP, because it's the largest party, deserves a little more attention. And then finally, we'll talk about a number of specific countries. But first, I think we're going to start out with an overview of what the vision of the European Union is of what may now well be the most pro-European government in the continent. The government of Spain, and the ambassador has kindly offered to provide that perspective of, where should the EU go, what is the future of the project.
Well, thank you very much, Stan. Thank you, Dalibor, and thank you for my colleagues here today at the panel, Ben and Yascha. Thank you to all of you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you to Fernando, who's here with me, our colleague at the embassy who follows the domestic policy here in the United States and our relations with Europe. It's a pleasure. I will try to be brief, just a general overview. I would say my first point would be that, yes, these elections are important, and for two main reasons. The first one is that we're seeing a challenge to the world order we've been living with since the World War II, since the end of the war, and a challenge to the values that sustain that order. And these values, of course, democracy, multilateralism, free trade, rule of law, are challenged, but they are also the very same values that are the basis of the European Union. So, yes, the basis of the European Union are under challenge because they are under challenge all over the world. The second reason is because, as you have mentioned, yes, there is talk of that we're going to see a more fragmented parliament, a more divided parliament with parties to the right of the traditional right coming up in the parliament, and a parliament that might be more difficult to take decisions and to form coalitions. To that, I would argue, in general terms, I would say first that yes, the challenges are real of the European Union. That's true. We're facing great geopolitical insecurity in the world. We need a new global world governance. It's true also that there is greater economic competition and that the economic challenges are still important in Europe. It's true also that there is a greater polarization, not only in Europe, but certainly too in Europe, and a questioning of this representative democracy in our countries, and the rise of nationalism, which is a reality, and we see it also in my country with the successionist threat in our country. But I would also argue that in Europe we're not in a crisis mode anymore. I think we've been in crisis mode, but we're not. We're in a post-crisis mode. I think we've beyond the point in which we were all talking about the crisis and the different crises. The challenges are real, yes, but we are now talking about how to face this new phase of post-crisis. And I think in reality there are many different options. But there is a debate, a real debate, with many documents, many positions. So we're moving forward. And the path, I think, is clear. And just outlining it very, very simply, but I think we need to recuperate the foundational narrative of the European Union. True. We need more projects that will be closer to the citizens. Yes, that's also true. We need a new social contract in Europe, or renew the social contract, because Europeans are feeling that they've been left behind and the promises of the European Union are not delivered anymore. And this is due, of course, you know very well, to the negative or perceived negative consequences of globalization and the acceleration of technological revolution, the feeling that we're being left behind, that others are benefiting, but that there is growing inequality. So we need to take measures to address that feeling of inequality, that feeling that the social contract has been broken. I would also add that, yes, the new parliament would probably have new cleavages, apart from the traditional left-right cleavage and the cleavage between Europeans, pro-Europeans, and more Eurosceptical members of parliament will increase, but also because there is a growing cleavage in in what we could call cultural or societal values in Europe. That is also true. So the cleavages are there, and we have to address that. But I would also point out one thing, that first, there has never been since the 80s such a great support in European public opinion for the European Union. So this is something that we have to take into account. Support for the European Union project is growing according to all polls, in part due to the Brexit, because people are realizing, first, that it's not easy to get out of a union. It's messy. It's not something that you do it easily. But second, and more important, because the Brexit has put forward the reality of what belonging to the European Union is, and the many advantages that being part of the European Union has, not only because of the changing world in which without a European Union, without a unified Europe, we would be completely irrelevant. No nation can really face up to the challenges of this changing world, but also because we really benefit from in many ways. And now, when we start talking about Brexit, we see that if you're out, you actually lose your European citizenship, you actually lose your ability to travel freely with one single currency, you actually lose the ability to move your goods and services across the whole European Union. So you lose a lot of things, actually, by getting out. And the reality we're seeing also in the world is, in our world in Europe, is that if a couple of years ago there was talk about others following up the Brexit, nobody talks anymore about Swexit or Netsit or Eat Out or whatever you want to call it. Now it's more, changes from within. And the parties that were against the European Union or talking about getting out of the European Union are not doing it anymore. They're talking about reforming from within. I read an article in The Economist the other day that the shakers that have suddenly changed into overturners from within. And that's a new element. And finally, my final introductory point is that Spain, as you mentioned, is really one of the countries now, I wouldn't say the most, but certainly one of the most, the countries that defends the purpose and the need for a strengthened European Union. We do believe in it, and we do believe that we can play a role in that. First, because we have the will, the political will. Second, because we have the support of our public opinion. If support for the European Union is about 60% or 62% inside the Union, in Spain is over 70, 74, 75%. So we're one of the countries, if not the most supportive of the European Union, in great part because we've benefited from it. The great change in our country has been due in many ways to our belonging to the European Union, also to our friendship and alliance with the United States, of course, and to the effort of the Spanish people. But belonging to the European Union has been key to the transformation of our country. So we have the will, we have the support of our people, and we have ideas. We've put forward ideas of how we should proceed, how we should reinforce the Union, and how we should go ahead in this process, which we believe is not only good for us Europeans, but is good for the world. I think we need a strong, unified Europe, allied with the United States, and by the way, with Latin American countries, because we share the same values. And if we want to build a post-Western world that keeps Western values, I think we have to stick together. And we have to keep on working for a unified union close to the United States.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador. And that did indeed deliver as a positive narrative of the European Union. To contrast that, I want to go to Ben, who can update us on the situation in the UK, which is, as always, in flux. How you see the relationship between the UK and the European Union in the coming years, what implications you think it'll have for the EU. Could you talk about that a little bit? Yeah.
Thank you. So the key thing to know about the European elections taking place in Britain is that they were not expected to take place. Mm-hmm. It had been expected that the UK would have left the European Union at this point. Neither of the major parties at the beginning of last year, and even at the beginning of this year, really expected them to be held. The consequence of the rejection so demonstratively, repeatedly, and aggressively of the exit treaty by the House of Commons, in particular to do with this clauses relevant to Northern Ireland, and how those have been interpreted by the nationalist wing of the Conservative Party as Versailles-style terms and an assault on British sovereignty, was not expected by either the leadership of the Conservative Party or the leadership of the Labour Party at the beginning of last year and well up until Christmas. Both parties entered this campaign unprepared and with two sort of points of view about what their electoral coalitions were made of that have come badly short, and who their real opponents were. The Labour Party has pursued a policy of strategic ambiguity about Brexit up until this point, traumatised by the experience of the Scottish referendum, where it believed that it burnt its bridges with the Scottish working class by being seen as defending the union shoulder to shoulder with the Conservative Party. It took a back seat on Brexit in 2016. The leadership team around Corbyn didn't expect it to be a major event. They believed that what lay ahead was an anti-austerity campaign. This was a fight in the Conservative Party. All the way through, that memory has been very sharp to them, and they were divided between those that were willing to leave the European Union in the context of a customs union and figure out the details later, an arrangement which would have allowed the UK to reclaim control over immigration whilst remaining, of course, within the tariff area, though with particular issues over control of trade deals that we can talk about in more detail later. And they were critically concerned about keeping on board working class voters that had voted for Brexit. The way they viewed it was that the Conservative coalition contains 25% of Remainers, and these people had been stress tested. If they were voting for Theresa May, they weren't really Remainers, but the 25% of their coalition which had voted Brexit and were voting Corbyn hadn't been stress tested. They didn't know if they were going to stick around. Entered into the elections, and their assumptions have been shown dramatically to be off the mark. Studies have been showing over the last few years that people's identities as Remainers or Leavers have become bundled up with their attitudes towards immigration and ethnic change, and that those have become more important than their identification with parties. And the Labour Party is seen to its horror. It's currently polling at the lowest level seen in national elections since 1910, that the party that was viewed as the most pro-Remain, the Liberal Democrats, has detoxified from its policies and collaboration, the coalition with the previous Conservative government, and is storming ahead with sort of 19% of the vote. The Green Party is, according to some polls, level pegging with Labour. So Corbyn has been caught in this situation. On the Conservative side, the Conservatives did not expect the excellently rolled out, very professionally done and sudden return of Nigel Farage to politics with the Brexit Party to have such an effect on their internal party, sense of purpose, discipline, and their broader electoral coalition. Nigel Farage's party, the Brexit Party, is polling between 35 and 40% of the vote. The Conservative Party, according to a poll I saw this morning, is polling at 7%. And the result of this performance, even before the final figures are on BBC News, as we speak, it looks likely that Theresa May will not survive the next 48 hours in her role as Prime Minister. So, as if that wasn't enough in busting both parties' conceptions of who their electoral coalitions are, who they need to keep on board, and who the real enemy is on both sides, parties that can outflank them on the sort of Brexit, cultural and identitarian issues, is what is the likely consequence on this on the Conservative Party leadership? from what I'm told, and take this as a snapshot and not a prediction, is that Boris Johnson is likely to emerge as the Conservative Party leader, or at any rate a Conservative who will embrace, at least officially, a no-deal Brexit as his preferred outcome if the European Union will not give in to British demands on Northern Ireland. This has alarmed the Labour Party, which is, from what I hear and from what I am being told, if this is taken as the point, if Brexit is redefined to mean what they view as a disaster capitalist Brexit, they will be obliged to back some sort of Remain position, especially if Remain view the danger of Remain voters deserting them in a general election. So if we try and sort of think ahead, and this would be the sort of predictive part of the and the sort of conclusion of this little talk, would be if we move towards the October 31st Halloween deadline for this round of the Brexit extension, we are likely to have at least officially no-deal Conservative leader. And this is going to be a radical departure from having Theresa May and her advisors at the head of the Conservative Party. A friend here recently joked that Theresa May's situation had been all along as if Jeb Bush had been elected, but only on condition that he implement Trump's policies. And the different situation there with the Conservative Party, and then with Labour sort of rebranding itself as a Remain party. We'll have both those forces coming to the decision on the 31st. So that will leave the Europeans in a difficult situation. It will be much harder to cut off the UK into a no-deal situation when you've got a large and powerful European movement, the party leaders calling for a second referendum, likely polling sort of better than the Conservative Party, and then what to do about an extremely intransigent partner on the sort of UK government side. Another element to be very worried about, and this I believe I have sharp criticisms of the European Commission's handling of this, is that there had been a lack of awareness and underestimating of the issue of Ireland and Northern Ireland in British politics, and the willingness by the Commission to place a pressure point on Northern Ireland has, we've already seen, an upsurge of low-level violence in the region, a lot of inflamed emotions in British and Irish politics, and this needs to be handled with extreme care as it remains a post-conflict situation. It shouldn't be viewed...
Can you clarify what you mean by the Commission using it as because as far as I can
by
tell...
that I mean Barnier and Barnier's team viewed it as simply a pressure point and didn't, I think, fully appreciate it as an emotional post-conflict situation. And I think this needs to be handled with care, and I think that the comms rollout of this was disastrous over the last year. The moment that maps appeared on UK TV showing Northern Ireland with the EU flag over it, this was a disaster for the successful implementation of the deal and moving on to the next phase. So you need to handle this with care, and that I think needs to be really at the top of minds.
In fairness to the Commission, I think they exceeded in large part to demands from a previous rendition of the UK government.
It's I hate to, as it's so cliche, I hate to quote Winston Churchill, but Winston Churchill did remark that the Irish genie has destroyed British governments 3 times in the 20th century, and this is an issue that has really haunted British politics, and how successfully Tony Blair and his partners dealt with it in the 90s, I think has led us to forget how emotive, painful, hard to resolve the issue can be. And I just think that all sides here need to handle it with care, and especially the United States needs to remember that it itself is a partner to the peace agreement, and I think that the Europeans have perhaps forgotten that the Northern Irish Protestant minority is also a partner to the peace agreement, and mechanisms that can sort of cool, delay and obfuscate on Northern Ireland. If we are heading in the UK to a sort of battle royale between Boris Johnson and a sort of more Remain Labour Party, I think that would be my one point of advice.
I see. Well, fortunately, Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn are both very composed, cautious politicians.
And with wildly different points of view on Ireland. Jeremy Corbyn believes in a united Ireland.
That's right.
Boris Johnson believes in a sort of no passaran in Northern Ireland.
That's right. Let's return to a country that has had calmer politics over the last few years. Yascha, can you tell us how the transition after Merkel's leadership of the CDU and of Germany is going? Whether Manfred Weber is going to be able to unite the peoples of Europe around him in adulation? What you think the election results are going to be? What German priorities are? Where you think the project is going?
Well, first of all, Stan, I think the peril of inviting free outside of AEI Europeans to a panel is that the old joke and cliche happens that we have about 5 opinions between us. So let me start by saying, with all due respect to the ambassador, that I think it is naive and dangerously naive to think that we've passed the moment of crisis in Europe. And I think some of what Ben was talking about, but some of what's going on with Manfred Weber and the broader situation in the European Parliament is a really important indication of that. So just to pick up on what Ben was just saying, I mean, the amazing thing for the last 2 or 3 years in British politics is that the most important question, obviously, at this point is Brexit and how to deliver it and whether to deliver it and what the future of a country should look like. And both of the major political parties, which have managed to monopolize about 80-85% of the vote between them at usual elections, sometimes even more, something that isn't any longer the case in lots of other parts of Europe, have contrived not to have an opinion on it, or not to have a clear opinion on it. And so it's no wonder that this has allowed an opportunity for the Brexit Party, which is, as the name implies, in favor of a very hard Brexit, but which should really be seen as the entry of a continental form of far-right populism into British politics, to establish itself in these upcoming elections as a major political force. And on the other side, a set of pro-Remain parties that don't do all of the foul compromises and obfuscation which Jeremy Corbyn has engaged in for the last 2 years as the alternative on the left. And that's actually not just a long-lasting transformation of a British political system, but a sign of the inability of the so-called moderate or established or traditional parties to deal with the stakes and the nature of the moment. So when you look at Manfred Weber, I think that is exactly an example of the same phenomenon. So you have this very important election coming up in Europe, in which the danger, which we haven't quite talked about properly yet, is the rise of far-right populist parties, which are likely to gain substantially more of a vote than 5 years ago, and therefore be able to block a lot of decisions in the European Parliament, potentially. And who do the European People's Party, the center-right coalition within the European Parliament, to which parties like Angela Merkel's CDU and CSU belong? Well, they nominate somebody who is widely known not to be, let's say, the very sharpest tool in the German box, and who, by the way, bears real responsibility for ensuring that Fidesz, the party of who I would at this point call the dictator in Budapest, still remains a member of the European People's Party. And so the face of the moderate parties fighting against an onslaught of authoritarian populism is somebody who has spent the last 3 years apologizing for an authoritarian populist, who has no charisma, who's not known outside of his country, and who many of his own party colleagues look down upon. How is that supposed to work? How is that an indication that we've understood the stakes of the moment? And just to say one more thing about Hungary, we've been talking about Britain for a long time. We've spent, about half a panel so far talking about Britain. I don't think that the Brexit crisis may be an existential threat to Britain. I'm not sure that's true either. But Brexit is not an existential crisis to the European Union. However, other developments on the continent are, because the very nature and point of the European Union is for it to be more than just a regional trade bloc. It is a community of values, and only that can justify why a German citizen should be willing to spread their sovereignty with a French citizen, why a French citizen should be willing to pool their sovereignty with a Dutch citizen. But how do you justify to these people in the long run that they now are pooling their sovereignty with effective dictatorships, countries no longer considered free by international organizations like Freedom House? I think this is an existential threat to what the European Union stands for and how long it will be able to legitimize itself towards its own citizens. So finally, where are we at with the European project? Well, where we're at, I think, is a pretty paradoxical moment in which a lot of European citizens, as some of these polls show, are actually broadly happy with where the European Union is, which is to say that they like the common market, they like the single currency in the countries that it hasn't completely screwed over. They like being able to travel freely and have Erasmus programs which allow the young kids to go and spend a year or a semester at some university abroad and so on and so forth. They don't want any further integration. They certainly don't want a pan-European welfare state. And they don't want a common fiscal policy, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem, I think, is that the relatively popular status quo is unsustainable as it stands. Because as long as the economy is growing, we can pretend that we've solved the crisis of the euro and all of those other things. But actually, solving some of those problems and dealing with the rise of authoritarian leaders in some EU member states would require some real institutional innovation, and either a big step back, like the dissolution of the euro, or a big step forward, like a common fiscal policy, a very powerful European finance minister, and so on and so forth. There's no popular will for either of those steps, and the rise of the populists in the elections that are happening now and coming up in the next days is going to make that impossible in any case. What you'll probably get is just enough strength for the moderate parties that four factions can somehow cobble together compromises, and that's the center-right EPP, the liberal ALDE, the center-left Social Democratic SND, and then one part of the Green Left movement, which represents parties like the German Green Party, which are reasonably moderate. Those four movements can in some complicated way hammer out compromises, but because they have a lot of ideological diversity within themselves, because they have a lot of geographical diversity within themselves of all of the conflicting interests that come with that, that is a minimum lowest common denominator coalition. So the ability to actually institute the kind of more radical and imaginative reform that the European Union would need in order to exit its crisis is going to further decline by the time we have these elections next week.
Fortunately, I believe Dalibor has a book forthcoming on the institutions of supranational governments.
Right.
And so maybe he can tell us how to deal with this.
So I'm not sure if I can give you the answer to all of Europe's big questions in 30 seconds. I mean, I certainly agree with very much with much of what Yascha said. At the same time, I'm always reminded in these conversations of the Holy Roman Empire, which was an entity that was seen as totally dysfunctional on its face. Samuel Pufendorf called it a misshapen monster, and yet this entity remained in existence for over 1,000 years. Not quite a federal state, more than just an alliance of local fiefdoms. And in a way, I see Europe through similar lenses today, that there is something about the European condition that pushes countries and nations towards some form of cooperation that sort of falls short of building a fully fledged federation along the lines of what founding fathers devised for this country. So I think we should try to perhaps avoid the habit of speaking of every problem that arises on the European continent as of a make or break moment, every crisis being an existential crisis. I think we are living in an age of political realignments, this cleavage between sort of parochial nationalist attitudes versus more cosmopolitan outlooks is going to be here. It's breaking up traditional parties as we see populism as this sort of thin ideology contrasting the ordinary people against the elite. I think it's facilitating some of these realignments and is helping challengers get on the stage and fight against the established incumbents. We might worry about the risks that this entails in terms of policies and institutional erosion, but I suspect that's the reality we have to deal with. And my hope is that Europe as a whole is quite resilient and will sort of muddle its way through it. I think muddling through is one of the sort of defining aspects of the European condition. If I may just say a few words about Central Europe, because very often this realignment and this cleavage that's arising between cosmopolitan versus parochial is sometimes seen as being mapped on Europe's divide between the new and old Europe. And if you are Steve Bannon, you look at New Europe as a sort of source of hope, that here are these traditionalist conservative leaders who are saying no to Brussels, no to immigration, etc. If you are a globalist, so to speak, you are worried about Central Europe. And I think the picture in reality is more complicated than that we are seeing these cleavages emerging all across Europe. And in many ways, Central Europe, the Visegrad countries, Eastern Europe, are more divided between themselves than that being just a simple cleavage between Central Europe and the West. I mean, so I think it's part of like my mission here. The way I see it is to seek to dehomogenize Central Europe in the eyes of the outsiders. If you look at the European election that's taking place in the 4 Visegrad countries, well, to a large extent, it's being driven by very different considerations in each of those countries. In the Czech Republic, there is going to be essentially a referendum about the prime minister, who is now trying to subjugate the court system in order to protect himself from prosecution. And there is a strong pushback against that from civil society, from the opposition. In Poland, there is this ongoing battle over cultural and ethical issues, LGBTQI rights, the new evidence of sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church. I mean, that's been sort of dominating the headlines, and I think it will be reflected in the polls. In Slovakia, I think Slovakia right now has probably the most European of the political debates of these 4 countries in the heart of Europe, in the sense that people have been taking positions on these more abstract, long-term questions of European architecture, and there is this energy on one side of the spectrum to bring Slovakia fully into the integration core, whatever it's going to look like in a few years' time, and also the energy on the other side of the spectrum to prevent that from happening. Slovaks are going to send a bunch of bona fide neo-Nazis to European Parliament in this election. And finally, I mean, Hungary, unfortunately, is just being Hungary. Fidesz has successfully suffocated the opposition, which is demoralized, finds it impossible to compete on a level playing field with Fidesz, with its concentrated media ownership and its crony system. So you know, even these 4 small countries in the heart of Europe are between themselves quite different, and I think the dynamics and the results that you'll see this weekend are going to be quite different. And that sort of tension about muddling through on a continent that's this diverse, I think, is something that's going to be just sort of remain with us as a sort of defining characteristic of being European, I suppose.
I think all of that. I think all of that is right. So I wanted to give the ambassador to respond to Yascha's claim that you were a little naive to say that Europe's crises are part of the past, and I took that as referring to the economic crisis that dominated the headlines, sort of during the fallout from the financial crisis. But obviously, other issues do continue. So Spain, for example, of course, has its own sort of populist upswing that in Spain manifested itself mostly in Catalan nationalism and the secession movement. And so I wanted to give you the chance to both respond to Yascha and to talk about the situation there. Spain has local and provincial elections this weekend too, so there's
that's right.
There's activity.
That's right. Too. Yes. No. What I was referring is that, and I insist, we're not in crisis mode anymore. and not realizing it is not really understanding the dynamics of Europe nowadays. What President Juncker or President Tusk said in 2016, 2017, when they were talking about existential crisis, polycrisis, nobody's talking about it anymore. We're talking about different things. We're moving forward. So I think, yes, we're facing, as I said, enormous challenges, very serious challenges. But we're not talking now of being in the middle of a crisis, of putting out fires. We're thinking ahead with different opinions, of course, many different opinions. But the situation is very different. And yes, in Spain, where we have now a government that is very much pro-European and willing to play an important role in the new Europe and reforming of European institutions, of moving forward. I read an article the other day saying that after the elections we could have, and this is based on projections on the European Parliament, either a Merkel Parliament, in which still the old coalition between, or understanding between the Popular Party and Socialists and Democrats would sort of rule the Parliament. Interesting enough, a Sanchez, our Prime Minister Parliament, in which there would be more a coalition, a leftist coalition, SD plus other forces on the left and Greens, or what we're seeing now in the press, some sort of Macron parliament in which there would be a coalition almost from Macron to Tsipras, from France to Greece, in which Macron would play this role of leading the Renaissance Europe forces in a very wide coalition. But Spain, I insist...
but would those numbers add up to a majority?
No, I think that would be difficult. And yes, it will be fragmented. Building up coalitions will be difficult, that's clear. And after these elections, it will be more difficult. But perhaps that's not bad. There will be more debate. There will be more open debate. It's not so bad. I think, like in Spanish Parliament too, we were used to have two main political parties. Now we have 5 political parties. And that's not necessarily bad. I think it opens up the discussion about the issues, and it widens the debate.
I'm from the Netherlands. Every member has its own party,
which is good. So I think that could be actually positive for the debate on the future of Europe.
Are you as optimistic? Ben, sorry.
No, I'm not. I mean, I think it's characteristic that the ambassador responded in terms of what people are talking about in Europe and not what's substantively happening. So if we're asking, is there a sense of crisis in Europe, then I agree with you that there's been a fundamental shift in the last 2 or 3 years.
That's what I was
Then
referring
after 2016, with Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, people said, oh my God, what's happening? We actually need to change things. And then what happened is that the drivers of the crisis remained the same. Populists kept winning everywhere across the world, and they're still going to have a record result, but the sense of crisis went back, and we're now sort of in the nice feeling, you asked me about Germany, that the most successful German post-war Chancellor Konrad Adenauer won a series of elections on. This is keine Experimente, no experiments. Let's just keep doing the same thing, and somehow we'll end up getting back to where we were. Now, by the way, I agree with you. We shouldn't overestimate the likelihood that everything collapses in one huge bang. It could be that we get an equivalent of a Holy Roman Empire, but that's a pretty depressing outlook. But the best case scenario we're aiming for is a series of institutions we all know to be dysfunctional and are all reasonably unhappy with, but because it's too complicated figuring out how to reform or improve them, we're all sort of stuck in them. I take that seriously as a prediction for the future, as it doesn't give me more hope than I had before.
I'm half French, and I'd like to make talk a little bit about France, and I think that might sort of add something to this conversation. So one of the places in the European elite where there is a sense of alarm and crisis is in the Élysée, as far as where they view the arc of Macron's European project.
It's because people are rioting right outside their houses. It's because people are rioting right outside their houses.
Well, and so Macron Macron's act of political realignment by breaking the left, breaking the right, trying to create this big pro-European coalition, holds within it, and we're now seeing that come to pass, a very dangerous prospect of creating the only alternative being the populists and presenting the opportunity for a populist alignment like the like of which we saw in Italy to sort of potentially develop in France. And that has begun to develop in the streets in the form of the Gilets jaunes sort of riots. And I get the impression from where I sit going back and forward between the US and those two countries that the long-term risks to the UK are dramatically overplayed by the British elite's willingness and excitement to have their meltdown in public. And in France, it's very underplayed by sort of by the sort of approach of French of dignity to these situations. It's been a real cause of alarm for the French president that despite excessive, violent levels of behaviour in the streets, truly alarming levels of anti-Semitism, of conspiratorial thinking, very large levels of mobilisation, this movement for close to 4 or 5 months held the support of the majority of the French people. And the majority of the French people were thinking about what does this mean, this could be interesting, what are likely political outcomes of this. Macron, in response, drops his entire economic targeting and economic programme long-term, caves into their demands. Parallel track of this is that Macron's strategy, that all he needs to achieve is another replica of this photo of Épinal between the leaders of France and Germany. The wheels have come off there. And Macron's sort of diplomatic sell, a lot of pessimism, bitterness, personal anger towards Germany, that their offers have been rebuffed, and an unwillingness from Macron to view that he didn't try and make different Euro coalitions, being very sort of dismissive to Spain, the Spanish governing, now sort of truly governing party, and going for a clash with Salvini when those were the logical partners on the Euro. A lot of belief that his political project of trying to go for a very narrow pact between liberal parties, between En Marche, an exclusive relationship with Ciudadanos, an exclusive relationship with Renzi in Italy, not perhaps been as successful as other alternatives. So there's a lot of sense of gloom about that. And if we look at the polls themselves, we're not talking about the fact that we've got a lot of road to run and that Marine Le Pen's party is polling at 45% for the next presidential elections. And something that I've seen in my lifetime as a French citizen is that the percentage that I'm told that they can never go beyond in a French presidential election keeps on rising. I remember being told they'll never get into the second round, they'll never go beyond 20%, 30%, and now we're looking at a 45% there. The European elections are interesting now.
We did that here 3 years ago with Trump in the Republican primaries.
Oh, really? The European elections.
This, by the way, I was very briefly. I was my latest book, which, by the way, is The People versus Democracy, not The Age of Responsibility, which is my boring PhD dissertation. I was in Brazil a couple of weeks ago because the book came out there, and I was so struck by people's reaction to Bolsonaro, because it's the reaction that political elites have had to every populist leader anywhere I've been and spoken to, which is that in Venezuela, Venezuelan elites after Chavez said, that guy, that unwashed idiot over there, he's never going to ruin our country, come on. And it's the same reaction that you see in France, even now with Marine Le Pen. It's the same that I heard in Brazil with Jair Bolsonaro. And so I think that's a real danger. But we keep saying, no, come on, these guys are so unreasonable. There's a natural ceiling, and we keep adjusting the ceiling,
exactly.
But we never learn that there isn't a natural ceiling necessarily.
So what we see in the European elections in France is we've got quite a good idea of the base that the National Front, rebranded as Le Rassemblement National, has against La République En Marche, Macron's party. So it's likely that the forces of Le Pen will come first, probably around 25%. And it looks like Macron's going to come second after a very poorly executed
campaign. Why do French parties keep changing their names?
I think it's because of these moments of disruption in French history associated with the wars and You know, sort of, if you want to know the reason a lot of French newspapers changed their names between before and after World War II, it's a lot of them had to as they were collaborationist papers. Yeah. And so this is like a good hint for me of what we can expect in the next presidential election, Macron's base and Le Pen's base would look like. So it looks pretty likely that even with Le Pen being not a good candidate, nowhere as good as her niece, kind of lazy, poorly spoken, she's still pretty likely to be in the second round. And moving beyond that, if you look at the other parties, there's another very interesting trend that's going on. One is a shrunken, greening left. The left manifesto is hard to distinguish, and we were talking earlier about how left activists are hard to distinguish, especially if they're millennials, between the left. It's the left and the Greens. And on the centre-right side, with the Républicains, who are now viewing it as a success that they're polling at 15%, their manifesto is extremely hard to distinguish from that of Le Pen. Refine Europe's Christian roots, becoming, in a way, a party of an activist and somewhat radicalised Catholic minority in France.
So there's two things happening, right? So on the one hand, you have these populist parties growing their support base, but on the other hand, it does seem like there's also a realignment sort of across the political spectrum with more specialized, smaller parties. So we have 5 in Spain now. Obviously, France has always had this a little bit, but it certainly now has at least 3 or 4 clearly distinguishable political factions. Germany, of course, the AfD is now on board. The Netherlands keeps adding parties. The UK now has 5, 6 parties that compete. Where do you guys think that is going? Because certainly under some electoral systems, you can't have a situation where that many parties persist, right? So is it just the system has been scrambled and the eventual outcome is going to be something like Macron versus Le Pen? Or do you think we're in a new equilibrium where the core cleavage of left-right on income redistribution, as you pointed out, is just no longer the only relevant, salient source of political identity, and instead there's also an anti-pro-EU and an anti-pro-immigration axis, and 3 axes create 8 parties, where 1 axis only produces 2. Where do you guys think this is going?
Well, certainly, I wouldn't just say that the economic axis is no longer primary in politics. I think there's definitely at least 2 axes now, but I would also say the cultural one is more important. And you see that throughout Western politics. So, if you ask somebody in the United States 30 years ago, where do you stand on economic questions? Do you think, tax rate should be higher or lower, right? A really simplistic question. That answer would have given you a pretty good guess as to whether this person is going to vote for the Democrats or the Republicans. It's one of the reasons why our lovely hosts here used to be closely associated with the Republican Party. Today, when you ask people that economic question, it gives you very little information of who they vote for. That's why this institution has been, in certain ways, politically adrift. The cultural question now gives you a lot more information. What do you think about certain aspects of LGBTQ rights? What do you think about immigration? Which movie should win the Oscar? All of those things help you predict, to an astounding extent, which party somebody supports. So there's 2 theses here. One is that you're always going to have these 2 axes, as well as some regionalist axes and other things that are easier to mobilize in an age of social media. And so that's why you get 5, 6 political parties, even in first-past-the-post system. The other is that what's happening is a transition. And certainly in Britain, for example, it seems to me the regional parties are going to stay strong, probably. But within England, we may get a lifestyle left party that is some mix of aspects of the current Green Party and aspects of Corbyn's project on the one side, and the Brexit Party on the other. Now, they may recapture the main parties, and they may still be called Labour and the Conservatives. But what's certainly clear with the utterly disastrous outcome of the upcoming election in Britain, where you'll have a Brexit Party have more share of the vote, most likely, than Labour and the Conservatives put together, is that the Brexit Party will either manage to replicate its success in national politics or the Tory party will choose to become a carbon copy of a Brexit party, which is essentially what's happening at the moment, I think.
Something that I found very striking is that Nigel Farage, of course, scored 30% in the last European elections, which is one of the reasons that triggered the decision to host the referendum. But what's happening now is that this score is having a far more destructive effect on their sense of collective responsibility on the Conservative side. And I am told that there are cabinet members who are voting for the Brexit Party, that there are people on the Conservative MEP list who are voting for the Brexit Party, are sort of people in the leading Conservative
that's
think
true
tanks.
altruism.
Well, it just shows where do these parties begin and end, which is an interesting question with the Labour Party, because I know that there are activists in the Labour Party
Ben, I think
voting Greek.
Change UK, I think, is in the middle of a debate where they're trying to decide whether they should support the Lib Dems outside of London and the South East.
Well, they should, is the answer. Something that is interesting to think about in terms of France, and where do we go from here, and do these populist, is there a path to a hegemonic position on the centre-right? Very clearly, the Le Pen family has been having a conversation about, clearly being an internal dropout, like Hungary or Italy, breaking the rules, a far more attractive prospect than trying to leave legally, like the UK, and the realignment of a lot of their staff suggests that.
But this is interesting, right? So because this is true, I think, across the EPP and even for the EPP itself, right? As you discussed, obviously they've kept Orban sort of on board. I think they're currently suspended, but who knows what that means. But different EPP member parties have chosen very different paths, right? So in France, I think rightfully so, the EPP member has certainly in general elections gone with the sort of establishment candidate over Le Pen, and so clearly distanced themselves from the far right. In Austria, I think Kurz very intentionally chose the opposite direction and said, look, with the far right, I can always form a coalition, and together we can govern. Consequences be damned. Obviously, Angela Merkel has chosen the French path. Do you guys have a sense? Is it just the personality of the leader? What is it about the countries that makes these parties reach different decisions? Because it certainly looks like the Tories are going to go the Austrian route. Obviously, Republicans here have done that in a sense.
Well, I think one of the questions is about the nature of a populist party. Both how extreme it is, but most importantly, what the nature of its institutional links to neo-Nazi movements is, right? So one of the things that has made it very hard historically for center-right parties in Germany and France to be open to those coalitions is that these are countries that were deeply marked by World War II, and the nature of the far-right parties that were breaking through had very obvious and sometimes official links in neo-Nazi and post-fascist movements. I think one of the dangerous successes of the far right in various countries is its ability to sever those links. The FPÖ has mostly managed that, not very professionally, but it has, in certain ways, it looked like it was a more professional
Certainly
party
compared to the
than some of
50s.
Yeah. Certainly compared to the 50s. But something like Vox in Spain is a very interesting phenomenon in that respect, right? It is institutionally a very new foundation that therefore is harder to associate with the extreme right, even if it relitigates a lot of the questions that structured Spanish early democracy around where Franco is buried and other questions on the side of the far right, and in a way that implies certain forms of sympathy for the fascist
The leader of its MEP list used to be a Falange candidate. The ties are...
But just back to this question of which of the axes matter more. Is it something that I've spent a lot of time talking about with friends in the British and American...
Have you established a definitive answer to the question?
I found an interesting answer in the Netherlands, actually, which is there's a certain view that if only the UK could really sort of nationalise the railways, pump a lot of money into declining towns, we really will get on top of this. We won't have to worry about these things in the same way. And I found myself on a study trip to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where the city actually looks like everything that the British left would dream of. New station, new construction.
Shipping containers everywhere.
Automated, it's Europe's biggest port. It is the Corbynite AOC dream of what a city should be like. And then you look at the electoral results, where this is the city which gave Dutch politics Pim Fortuyn with his rocket rise and then assassination, setting the stage for Dutch sort of populist politics, his free experimentation between elements of liberalism and nationalism being a very potent cocktail. And you have voters in this city where you have maybe 30% that have solidly been voting for populist nationalist parties now for about 20 years. So you're trying to work out, well, what's the main driver here? Like, what's happening? And then you look at the pace of ethnic change which has been happening in Rotterdam, which is the city is now an immigrant city, it's a majority minority city, it's over the last 25 years become an incredibly diverse place. And then you look at the other end of the spectrum, you have two populist Islamist parties sitting in the city council. One more sort of Arab variant linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, one more sort of Turkish variant linked to the AKP. So I recently wrote an essay about how Rotterdam, in a way, is the city of Europe's future.
I think it's more Turkish nationalist than Islamist.
Well, that sort of thing. Rotterdam is the sort of, in a way, a city of Europe's future. One that we should look at perhaps a lot more than we currently do.
And so then what you would get is sort of sort of an ethnically white populist party, and then the rest of the spectrum a little more.
I think that
more scrambled.
You can blunt the edges of these identitarian clashes over what it means to be a nation with excellent public transport, with massive house building, but you can't take it away. And what I found illustrative in Rotterdam, which was that the parties that had very, very clear answers about ethnic change were doing well. You have the Green Left, which is doing well there, because it says ethnicity and citizenship and identity they're not linked. This is the kind of city we want. Then people like Thierry Baudet and the Forum for Democracy doing very well, but they say the exact opposite. And the Labour Party sort of struggling in the middle, and sort of Rutte's party also not doing too well.
Just a footnote to that point, which is that I've seen a bunch of articles in the last couple of years looking at the relative success of Green parties as saying, perhaps there's a backlash against populism. Perhaps these parties, which seem to be the opposite in Germany, for example, of the Alternative for Germany, are a sign that this populist movement is passing. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the causes of the rise of these parties. It is not a sign that this populist realignment is not happening. It is one of the manifestations of it. Because when the cultural dividing line becomes what drives politics, then within the left coalition, a lot of voters are going to go from more traditionally social democratic parties that have an emphasis on the economy to things like Green parties that have an emphasis on culture. So German politics is polarizing between the Green Party on the one side and the Alternative for Germany on the other side. I have a lot more sympathy for the Green Party than the Alternative for Germany. In that sense, I'm happy when we do reasonably well, but I'm not reassured about the direction of German politics, because this is just the other side of the same coin.
Let's go to Dalibor, and then we'll open it up to our
So I suppose
guests.
one way these realignments play out is that they essentially divide or break up pre-existing parties by introducing new issues that drive these coalitions away. And how things play out in specific terms really depends on the local context, on the electoral system. In a place like the Netherlands, you end up with lots of parties that will then go into elections and then will form coalitions in an ex post manner after the election. Well, that's not sustainable in other countries where these different groups have to form coalitions ex ante by sort of building sort of big tent parties. And so I think we are in the midst of these dynamics on the continent, and that puts strain on these traditional political families, which are composed of parties that don't look really alike anymore. And one of those, obviously, is EPP. One of the reasons why Viktor Orban has not been dealt with in the manner he should have is the expectation that many in the EPP had, which was that the future really lied in that direction set out by Sebastian Kurz, that we will have no enemies to the right, and so why should we be like rocking the boat with Viktor Orban if that's our future? That's our future anyway. Well, I'm not sure that's the future because many members of the EPP would not be terribly happy with that sort of outcome. And if you look at the moderates in Sweden and other countries, in the Netherlands, etc., there isn't that much of a support. And I think Sebastian Kurz himself has become much less of a believer in that sort of outcome. I'm not sure to what extent that's driven by this video and this scandal around Strache himself. It wasn't exactly a secret that the party had ties to Russia. It signed a memorandum of understanding or sort of some sort of pledge of cooperation with United Russia, Vladimir Putin's party in Russia. And it's been, Austria, it's been very much part of the political landscape, even on the sort of respectable EPP right. Wolfgang Schüssel, the former chancellor, is one of the most vocal defender of the regime in the sort of Christian democratic circles. Vladimir Putin came to Karin Kneistel's wedding, the foreign minister, and danced with her. So this sort of idea that Strache would ask for Russian money when given the opportunity, I don't think it's going to do much to his electoral base. So the decision that Kurz took to dissolve the coalition and go for elections, I find it hard to believe that it was driven just by that one scandal. Rather, it would make sense to me to see it as just his political instincts telling him that this is not the way of the future for the Austrian People's Party.
I agree. Let's go. Let's take questions from the room. We have a lot of different topics that we've covered. I'm going to start over there on the table in the back, middle, blue jacket. Please wait for a mic. Please do not deliver a speech, but produce a question. Typically, questions end with question marks. Yeah, you know the drill. Okay.
I'm Aaron. I actually am an editor at the American Interest, so I edit Ben and Dalibor. My question is, you've described populists as authoritarians, and I tend to agree with your description. But it seems that the claim the populists are making is, yeah, but you EU centrists are yourselves authoritarian. You're just masking it in the language of liberalism. And there's this sort of accusation of a soft despotism dictated by Brussels. My question is, first, what's wrong with that view, if anything? Second, why does that view seem to have such currency right now, and what can the EU concretely do to diffuse it?
Look, I'll tell you what's wrong with that view. I was in Central Europe a couple of months ago for a documentary and a piece traveling along the old Iron Curtain on both sides of it, so from Szczecin and the Baltic to Trieste and the Adriatic. And when I was in the city of Sopron in Hungary, a city that's always been a middle-class city, a very affluent place on the border to Austria, very beautiful. You walk around and you think if you're here as a tourist, it would all seem lovely. And when you start asking people in the street about their political opinions, and they say, I'm not going to talk on record. And you say, well, okay, we'll talk off the record. Why? And I say, well, because if I don't like the government much, and if I say this publicly, I might lose my job tomorrow. You might lose your job. Do you work for the city or do you work for the state? No, it's a private company. But, we have some public contracts, and, they would put pressure on my boss to fire me. Right? This is in the middle of the European Union today. So what I call populists, and why I sometimes say authoritarian populists, is a set of people who essentially say, I and I alone stand for the people. The only real reason why we have problems today is that the governing elites are corrupt and self-serving and so on, and we need to get rid of them and put common sense politics into place. But it's this exclusive element of it, I and I alone stand for the people, which leads to autocracy. Because inevitably they say that a free press that criticizes them are the enemies of the people, that opposition politicians who stand up to some of the policies are traitors, and that most importantly there's no legitimacy in courts or law enforcement agencies and other institutions that might investigate them for ill doing and so on and so forth. Now, it might sound like I was gerrymandering that description to the United States, but in whichever country I am where there's an authoritarian populist in power, people think I'm gerrymandering my description to that place because it looks the same in Venezuela. It looks the same in Hungary. It looks the same in various places to different extents. I mean, in some countries, the system has already been captured, and in some other countries, there's still a struggle going on. But the nature of it is exactly the same. Now, the problem is that a lot of existing elites are not sufficiently accountable, and our system is not always sufficiently democratic, so that elites sometimes ignore the preferences that the large majority of the population have. That's something, and I tend to agree with elites rather than the people on that, but it's important to be honest about it. That's true about immigration in Europe for the last 30 or 40 years. So that's why it resonates, and that's a real problem that we have to think about and address, but it is of a completely different nature and magnitude than citizens in the middle of the European Union being afraid to state their opinion.
Maybe sort of just to add to that. So I've similarly travelled around France and gone to these different towns run by Le Front National, where I have been shown people are producing lists of ethnic percentages of schools to try and identify how many children are Muslim, where I've been shown the great replacement which is taking place by governing officials in schoolyards, and where you have a similar fear of losing your job, fear of talking on the record, and where local police and the party, it's very hard to tell what's what. A caveat about the word populist, or should we use populist nationalist, and why I can sometimes be uncomfortable about some of this, the way language is used, is maybe outside the European Union, in Ukraine or in Mexico, when people go, there is a real people and a rapacious elite. Well, there's an element of truth to that in countries that are dominated by oligarchs. And I sometimes get worried about, is our use of terms restricting the ability of anti-corruption activists in particular to fiercely criticise their elites? That's one problem that I have. I think that we need to, as you hinted at earlier, be very attuned to categorising different populists. You know, are they linked to neo-Nazi parties? Are they national populists? Are they authoritarian populists? Are they left populists? Because all of them have very different consequences to human rights. Like there are left populists whose real goal is that they want to radically democratise or use referendums, which I don't think is a good idea, but that will have a very different consequence on human rights to a party that's linked, that is authoritarian or linked to neo-Nazi movement. So that's one issue. And then an element that I'm worried about is there is often a willingness to try and shut down criticism of either a pro-immigration position or a neoliberal economic position with this term. So it's just, I'm just trying to, I don't actually have a solution of how to talk about this better, but maybe you do.
Just 20 seconds, I know I agree with most of what you just said, but I do think it's very, very important to point out that it's not just populists on the right who are dangerous. And so with a colleague, Jordan Carl, we did a database of different populist governments since 1990. And what they did to civil and political rights, to the democratic standing of a country. And there's no systematic difference between left-wing populists and right-wing populists, or sort of centrist, politically indistinct populists in that database. So when you think of people like Chavez and a lot of the other Latin American populists in Latin America, they do have the same nature, and even for the goals maybe to democratize and so on, in the end, they persecute opponents and shut down debate in exactly the same way. And so I do think it's dangerous in this debate to start saying we should talk about nationalist populists, we should talk about far-right populists, because really the ones on the left are okay. And when you use the definition of populism that we've been using, when you don't say anybody who wants to raise taxes is a populist, which is a completely different thing, then left-wing populists are just as dangerous as right-wing populists, and we need to acknowledge that.
Yeah, but that's a great criticism. It's just I'm just struggling to, so a question is Corbyn's Labour populist or not? That's an interesting question.
Let's go to the next question. Let's go over here. Dark burgundy tie.
Thank you. Bill Veal, retired Foreign Service. One of you mentioned that this new parliament might play a delaying or blocking role in the policy process there. But I wanted to ask, what do you think that the new parliament might be able to engender in terms of the balance of power between the European Commission and the European Parliament?
Does that, anyone have strong views on this?
I think we will do a no.
So I think we've definitely, over the past 3 or 5 years, partly because of the crisis, we've seen a movement back toward intergovernmental decision-making as opposed to supranational decision-making. And I think a parliament that's this divided will only make that movement stronger. So I think we'll move back sort of to where we were 15, 20 years ago, before the parliament got its new legislative powers. If not legally, certainly effectively. So I think that will be my prediction, because I don't see how this parliament can really play a particularly strong role. Let's go to the person right behind you. Yeah. Sorry, please wait for the mic. Yeah.
My name is Roger Cochetti. I work with private equity in the technology sector. And in this sort of complicated game of thrones, we have layers. Underneath the 21st century cultural divisions are the 20th century ideological divisions, and under them are the 19th century national divisions. And I'd like to ask about 4 of the national divisions. No one has brought them up because, like a volcano, the lava can sort of spurt up through everything and disrupt all the upper layers. And one is Scotland. The second is Gibraltar. The third is Catalonia, and the fourth is Greece. These really haven't been brought up. Would any of the panelists care to talk about these 19th century issues, which can push their way up through the ideological and cultural divisions that have grown up over time?
I think at least 2 of those are.
Yeah,
of interest to
exactly.
you.
2 are under my. The other 2 I wouldn't dare, but certainly. But let me say that I'm happy to represent today here the positive view on the European Union. Just to start, I really believe that we need the European Union, and that the situation, in spite of what you might see, is still very positive. I mean, we are 6% of the population, 23 or 24% of GDP, world GDP, 60% of world funds for cooperation. We've managed to surmount a very important financial crisis. We remain united in face of a very important crisis, which was the Brexit. We really have a debate on where we should go. So I think we should look at the good part of it. Europe is necessary, and the friendship between Europe, the transatlantic relationship, is very important in the making of the new world. So I want to believe in that we Europeans will manage to move forward in this path that has been extremely positive for Europe and for the world. And now I do want to answer your 2 questions. Catalonia. Yes, Catalonia is exactly the contrary of the European project. It's building walls and separations when we are trying to, on the contrary, bringing down walls and bringing together the European people. And Catalonia issue is important, very important for Spaniards. Is a challenge, a tremendous challenge, a political challenge that needs political solutions, and we are aware of that. I think we're moving forward, and the government has expressed its willingness to dialogue and to try to find political solutions. What is clear here in the United States, in Europe, anywhere in the world where there is a democracy, is that you have to respect the rule of law and that you have to respect the Constitution. That's the only limit. You can think whatever you want, you can defend your ideas in whatever form, you cannot just break the law. This is the basis of a democracy. And on the issue of Gibraltar, I think it's also an important issue in view of the Brexit. Once Gibraltar is a colony, the last remaining colony in Europe, that is very clear, declared by United Nations in many occasions, international law, and it's no doubt about it, it's a colony. And it should be decolonized according to United Nations. It's an issue, a bilateral issue between the UK and Spain, and the UK and Spain are talking continuously about it, and the proof is that in view of Brexit, We, the two governments, have just signed a treaty on taxation in April and have signed 4 MOUs on issues that are important for British people, for the people of Gibraltar, and for the Spaniards that also cross into Gibraltar to work there. So we're working with the British so as to make sure that if there is a hard Brexit or not, whatever form of Brexit, if there is the agreement or without agreement, that the people of the region do not suffer. What we expect is that we will continue this cooperation with the United Kingdom, and at the end we'll find a solution. We are allies, we're partners, and we should find that solution. And I wouldn't be too worried about the repercussions of Brexit, because as we've said, we've managed to sign these MOUs and this treaty just now.
You want to talk about Scotland?
I can even add a little joke about Gibraltar.
Oh, well, what's the joke?
So I have a British citizenship and a French citizenship. In reality, I'm a Sephardic Jew and grew up in an Orthodox community in London with a rabbi from Gibraltar. And Gibraltar has a great, strong, beautiful Jewish community of Sephardim. And few people know that in 1492 there was an attempt to create a Jewish state to save us from the Spanish cultural genocide in Gibraltar. So a possible compromise could be, Baruch Hashem, it happens soon. So, on Scotland, I knew that would go down well. So, on Scotland, the situation is really in flux.
The genocide was expulsion, just to make sure the right word.
I dispute that utterly and completely.
Yeah.
And so Scotland, the situation is very much in flux. First thing to say is I think that we have moved into a new state of the union, and it's far closer to a zombie union in the same political framework, but in reality the politics, the issues, the electoral cycles are completely out of kilter. In Scotland, you have the SNP in this hegemonic position, Labour reduced to a very small minority party, out of sync with the English-dominated branch of Labour. In fact, it's quite a sort of Blairite legacy in many ways. You have the Conservatives enjoying a boost in popularity as a party of a clear answer on the union, unlike the Labour Party. So that's domestically, Scotland's in flux, this zombie union situation. And what does it mean about Brexit? So whenever I go to Scotland, I'm very struck by the fact that it's not the same country in the way that it used to be 10 years ago before this political change. And I felt very much after the referendum, okay, logically, there's going to be a giant, lasting shift in favour of Scottish independence. That did not come to pass. And in fact, there's been an interesting shift in which individuals who supported Scottish independence have decided, in fact, they like Brexit more. And that they've gone over to the idea they'd like to remain in a more nationalist, independent UK. And there have been more of them than the expected other side round. So one thing that I find, and this is just purely anecdotal, is a lot of friends that I have who were sort of drawn to, one could say, the populism of Scottish independence, have now not so keen on that, having seen how difficult it is for Britain to leave the EU, Scotland leaving the UK with, for example, how would we divide up the Egyptian mummies in the British Museum, and all these kind of issues would be really, really upsetting and painful. So that's currently in flux. Nicola Sturgeon's calls for speed up and second Scottish independence referendum. One of the motivating factors is she's really worried that her party's long run of dominance in Edinburgh could be coming to a close. Is the window closing? They're never going to have such a caricature Tory government. You know, is this the moment?
I don't know, Boris Johnson is about to become the head of a party.
But Boris Johnson's a pure cynic,
yeah,
which is the issue for them. So they're very worried about that. And so it's very much in flux.
My prediction would be, and it's been a very good way of forecasting for the past 150 years, is that soon the British people will rule over less land and fewer people than they do right now. Dalibor,
I was just going to say that you could have added many more places or issues to your list, starting with Südtirol, going through Hungarian minorities in neighboring countries, and the extent to which Hungarian politics today is still shaped by this shadow of Trianon is striking. And one of the things that nationalism does, and this bringing nationalism to the forefront in politics does, is that it sharpens these divides, which is one of the reasons why this dream that some people have of an international nationalist movement is doomed to failure. One of the first things that FPÖ started doing when it arrived in this government coalition in Austria was it started its outreach to German speakers in north of Italy, in Südtirol. I'm not sure what Matteo Salvini and the League think of that. Fidesz, they like to complain about George Soros showering money over liberal programs and NGOs. Essentially, the reality is that George Soros has spent a fraction of the money that the Hungarian government and Hungarian oligarchs are spending every year on the outreach to Hungarian minorities in Romania, in Slovakia, in Ukraine. It's very often taking the form and shape of Fidesz-connected businesses buying football clubs, and has had some real repercussions. Hungary has been torpedoing the efforts of Ukraine to get closer with NATO and the European Union, and I think if sort of nationalism is going to be the dominant theme of European politics going forward, I think we'll see many more of these things just popping up, bursting, like you said.
I think we have time for two more questions. We're going to go all the way in the back there, brown jacket, and then over here. Let's do them together. So can you bring the mic over?
Hi, Nick Burns, Mr. Ambassador. Sir, you talk, proudly of the high poll numbers in Spain for the European Union. Of course, Spain has benefited much from the Union, in perhaps a similar way to other economies that are compared to it, Italy, Greece. But crucially, it seems to me, unlike those countries, Spain has not had this set of obligations to migrants to the European continent. So I think one question would be, do you think that those numbers would be so high if Spain had had the same sort of experience as Italy or Greece? And the other question, you have to forgive me for asking this, but if Gibraltar is a colony, what is the status of Ceuta and Melilla in Africa?
Well, the second one is very easy. It's a United Nations description, so I'm not saying one is a colony, the others are not. And well, sorry, there was a.
You can go ahead. Then we take it. You can. Yes.
You've been speaking of Europe. My question is, what do you hope and/or fear the United States will tie into all of this?
That's a good question to close on. But let's go back to Spain first.
Yeah, no, and I think, very interesting recent poll says that in different countries of Europe, including Italy, we're more worried about migration out of our countries than migration coming to our countries. This is a recent poll. So I think there is a long way still to go in Spain, although we are receiving quite a lot of migrants. And as you know, as the routes have changed, from the eastern routes to the central route to the west route, we're receiving thousands and thousands of migrants. So I don't think it's a big issue in Spain, and I don't think it would change the numbers if there would be more migrants. And as in Italy, we're more worried now, right now, our public opinion, about people leaving the country than coming into our country.
Does everyone want to answer the last question about hopes and dreams about the relationship between Europe and the U.S.? Dalibor, you want to start?
I don't think I have that much to say beyond the obvious, which is that the European project is very much in America's interest. The efforts to sabotage it and to appoint ambassadors that do not get it, etc., is not very helpful. The idea that we should start a trade war with the EU over automobiles is not a very helpful one. I think there needs to be, a sort of cultivation of a shared understanding that goes across both political parties in this country of what really is at stake, and the fact that the European project is the appropriate response to what I described earlier as the European condition. And there has always been a certain tension on the political right with regard to the EU, to the European project, the way it binds countries together and reduces sort of the ability of popular majorities to do as they please. But I think that's a sort of job for think tankers and wonks to sort of make that intellectual case on this side of the Atlantic. And in the meantime, hope that we'll sort of avoid some of the looming clashes.
Yascha?
So we're at a very interesting historical moment. Ever since the late 19th century, the cumulative GDP of Western liberal democracies was higher than that of autocracies. And depending on how exactly you code it and so on, it's right around now that this is crossing again for the first time. That autocratic countries are going to be more economically powerful than democracies. I do think that that is a very, very large risk for what the world will look like, and it is a large risk as well for how well American corporations and so on are going to do. And so we need to recognize three things. One, as you've just very eloquently said, it is absolutely in the interest of the United States to make sure that sensible democratic forces prevail in European countries rather than some of those autocratic populists. The second is, and the same is true in other parts of the world, the second is that for all of its flaws and weaknesses, Europe remains a very powerful and economically significant part of the world, and giving up on the importance of that relationship is lunacy from the American point of view. And the third is that if we actually want democratic values and a free economy that's rules-based to succeed in the 21st century, we will need to go beyond the transatlantic relationship. The transatlantic relationship is the core building block. Then we have to hope that we can persuade other democratic or democratizing countries to join that fold. If the 21st century is going to be a democratic century, it needs to involve North America and Western Europe, and then it needs to powerfully incorporate allies beyond that region within it.
I think that one area where the EU and the US can really work very, very collaboratively on is the issue of anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy, and anti-offshore. Right now, we see that this issue of like how finance is weaponized and how financial flows are in and of themselves dangerous. Is this conversation's happening in anti-corruption organizations? It's not happening really in the national security mainframe of the debate. And one thing we need to urgently cooperate on together in order to not have situations like in Austria, like in the issues in France, like issues in Italy, like Putin establishing an extraterritorial bank in Budapest, like Belt and Road in Italy, is to recognize that an anti-money laundering shield, an anti-corruption shield over the West is as crucial in order to stop the Chinese and the Russians influencing and disrupting our politics as the boats we have at sea or the satellites we have in space, and that we need to work together to make that happen. In Europe, we have a lot of the rules, beneficial ownership, registry of bank accounts, and so on, but we don't have strong enforcement. Here you have strong enforcement, but you don't have the lot of the rules, and we need to collaborate there if we want to succeed after the tipping point that you just described.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Well, just very, very briefly, I would say that the US and Europe have a great advantage, and that we have allies. This is an asset that other countries do not have, and we should preserve it and take care of it if we want a better world. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Me tengo que marchar corriendo, que tengo a las 3.